Well, it's nice to be here. Nice to be in this place again. Nice to see some friendly known faces, other friendly unknown faces. Good to be here. Never quite so comfortable being this high up, but. And not overly comfortable being in the Easter season. The Easter season, of course, has always been the centre of the Christian community's life and celebration. And these weeks between Easter itself and Pentecost traditionally is a time when we focus on unpacking the Easter stories and seeing how they become for us the foundations of our faith. For someone like me, that's really hard, though. I've never been able to swallow either the dead man walking version of Easter Day or the he died for my sins understanding of Good Friday. And those appearances we heard about today. What do we make of the fish? What do we make of the unknown resurrected Jesus appearing to disciples, even more apparently appearing to Paul much later on the road to Damascus? So what I ask is, how can we be church for people who think like I do? Easy answer, of course, we don't have to. But actually, increasingly there are people around us who do raise questions, whose doubt, like Thomas from last week's gospel, is stronger than their sense of wanting to believe the literal stories we've been told. And the very notion of a progressive Christian church and congregation is about seeking to bridge that gap somehow. What I'm telling you is what you already know, of course, here. But I am aware it is not easy to be progressive in relation to the central Christian stories like those of Easter, and at the same time remain a recognisable, acceptable part of the wider Christian community. And I think for all of us who struggle with this, it helps to keep aware of the depth of the dilemma in this. It's a dilemma that is there in many institutions who try to find ways of being relevant and connected while not losing the roots of who they are. How are we to be in continuity with our heritage and at the same time be up to date and relevant to our context? I guess I've worried away at that dilemma all my ministry, and in many ways most sharply in theological education, with its aim of preparing people for leadership in a church in a changing world. And churches that dare to call themselves progressive, even if somewhat tenuously and not always well accepted or understood, face that dilemma all the time. Certainly, we struggle with it at St. Columba in Grey Lynn. How do we work with what we've received? How are we faithful to the core of all of that, and at the same time be contemporary, relevant to the thought patterns and questions that are around us in this context? My view is that the key lies somewhere in the complex idea of remembering, a deep concept within the Judeo-Christian tradition, the importance of remembering. How do we remember in the face of that dilemma? Well, one of the approaches, one of the tendencies, one of the temptations, if you like, is to think about remembering as returning, returning to key Christian markers so that we're held in that continuity with our heritage. Some of you have already heard me describe myself as a new kind of Anglican, C of E, one, however, that goes to church each week except Christmas and Easter. And why? Well, the reason for that for me is that in my experience, even quite progressive congregations show a tendency to return to the symbols and liturgies that restate the tradition around those celebrations in ways that I think do not always address the depth of the issues that are there. The stories are told in the usual way. The old hymns or carols are sung. The liturgical patterns are repeated. The cross and the angels reappear. And many of those things that have been added over the centuries in our church and our cultural history return to the sanctuary, especially for the occasion. The words of the liturgy that surround it all continue to reflect old ideas, old language, old patterns. We argue, of course, that we do that because we want to connect with people from the wider community who at times like Christmas and Easter, but particularly Christmas perhaps, know and want those familiar symbols and ways of doing things. They do, partly because, of course, they haven't been here week by week, hearing the way in which we might reinterpret, re-understand, reframe those. But there are other churches that meet the need for such a remembrance of return. And somebody like me is simply re-alienated from the tradition by doing that. Or we say that it's these celebrations, these stories that are so central to being Christian or being church that they have to be returned to. We cannot avoid them if we're to be Christian. And of course, there's truth in that. But this congregation, with sermons like the one I have read of Clay's on Easter Day, or the somewhat radical and dichotomizing billboards that stand outside this building from time to time, this congregation is very aware that the insights and issues of Easter and Christmas are not simple and straightforward, and they can be presented without the traditional word pictures. I do not believe that dilemma progressives face in the church is well resolved by remembering through returning to the traditions, just because that might be familiar, it might be what people want, it might even be what the wider church expects. So, of course, we can be tempted to go the other way. Our remembering can be rejecting rather than returning. We remember the traditional rite. We remember the stories and their interpretations, the symbols and the liturgies that have been built around them, and then we reject them. We throw them away. We go somewhere else. We move right away from those core stories and we read from things other than the Bible. We pick up symbols different from those that have been used regularly in the activities of church and community. Instead, we might focus on things like seasonal symbols. Very appropriate, actually, given the origins of a spring festival like Easter and a winter festival like Christmas.